You know it's going to be a long one when he brings the folder out. Right. My name's Christian, and it's an absolute privilege to be invited to share our thoughts during this great series that we're doing called Common Grace. Now, I remember a few years ago now, during my degree, so you can tell I'm a bit older than some of my predecessors here, but I walked into my favourite coffee shop in Manchester, and I'd gotten my coffee, and I sat down and I took a sip of it, and I went, oh yes, I'm home. And then I corrected myself internally because I thought, actually, home's your flat. It's a little way across the city. And then I thought, well, my parents would probably disagree and say that home is the family home down further south. And then I thought all of this was a bit unfair on my home country of Australia and thought that home should probably be somewhere over there. And the truth of it is that all of these places have been a home of sorts at one point or another. And you know when you come home. You know when you're home because you walk in and there's this transcendent feeling that you get when you're somewhere that's secure, where you're somewhere where you're known and where you're well valued. Now this series, we're looking at common grace. And common grace is God's blessings that are scattered throughout the world to believers and non-believers alike. And it's a really, really important concept to grasp. For example, it means that Christians, we don't need our own little Christian bubble, okay? You don't need to have your own Christian dentist and your own Christian teachers and only go to Christian artists, because there are gifted individuals all throughout the world. And those gifted individuals outside the church are gifts to people within the church as well. Secondly, it means that if you want to know God, you can go anywhere in the world. You can study anything in the world, because common grace tells us that God is at work in art, in nature, in literature, in media, in language, in different cultures, and we appreciate the truth and the wisdom that we find wherever we find it because it's reflective of the God who gives it. And thirdly, it's uncomfortably, it explains something that some people struggle with, and that's that there are people outside the church and people who do not believe in God who are more moral, more compassionate, wiser, more generous than people inside the church. Common grace tells us that the believer does not hold a monopoly on God's grace, but that common grace is at work in the lives of people around us. And we see God's grace in the concept of the home, okay? Whether you've seen an upset child, a teenager who's in trouble, a mother going back to work after maternity leave, or someone who's approaching the end of their life, there is this yearning for somewhere that's secure, somewhere that's dignified, and somewhere where you're valued. Maybe your home isn't like that. Maybe it's somewhere that's unsafe or intrusive or impersonal and you're just desperate to get away from there. But if God invented and puts his grace on the home, then what should it be like? And how do we get it? So we're going to have a look at an account in the Bible. And I need to introduce a couple of key characters to you first. First of all, there's Saul, and Saul was the first king of ancient Israel. He was anointed by God. He started off really well, and then he became quite fearful and bitter, and he didn't end well. Then there is David. Now, David started out as a servant of Saul's, and then he became a war hero, and he became a celebrity, and he was really well loved by the people, and Saul hated him, and Saul tried to kill him quite a few times. To complicate things, Saul had a son called Jonathan, and Jonathan and David, they loved each other. They were like brothers. And then Jonathan had a son called Mephibosheth. Now, Saul and Jonathan died in battle, and David was set to become the new king. And in these times, when a new king came to the throne, people would try and win favor with that king by killing anyone who may pose a threat to that throne. Okay, and typically people from the outgoing power's household who may try and challenge him. And we see this in the story of Mephibosheth, who and that's in 2 Samuel chapter 4. But Mephibosheth was 5 years old when Saul and Jonathan died in battle. And news of the death spread, and the nurse who was looking after this 5-year-old boy thought, I need to get him out of here because someone's going to try and kill him. And she scooped him up and she sprinted, and in her rush she dropped the child, and he broke his ankles and he would never walk again from that point. Many, many years later, decades later, we read this account in 2 Samuel chapter 9. One day David asked, is anyone in Saul's family still alive? Anyone to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake? He summoned a man named Ziba, who'd been one of Saul's servants. Are you Ziba? The king asked. Yes, sir, I am, Ziba replied. The king asked him, is anyone still alive from Saul's family? If so, I want to show God's kindness to them. Ziba replied, yes. One of Jonathan's sons is still alive. He is crippled in both feet. Where is he? The king asked. In Lodabar, Ziba told him, at the home of Machir, son of Amiel. Turn to someone around you and say, he's in Lodabar. He's in Lodabar. So David sent for him and brought him from Machir's home. His name was Mephibosheth. He was Jonathan's son and Saul's grandson. When he came to David, he bowed low to the ground in deep respect. David said, greetings, Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth replied, I am your servant. Don't be afraid, David said. I intend to show you kindness because of my promise to your father Jonathan. I will give you all of the property that once belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will eat here with me at the king's table. Mephibosheth bowed respectfully and exclaimed, who is your servant that you would show such kindness to a dead dog like me? Now Mephibosheth was found in Lodabar. And the name Lodabar has a double meaning. There's one sense in the word that means it's the land of no speaking. It can also mean the land of nothingness. And biblical names carry a certain significance that explains a bit more about the context of what's going on. And this name Lodabar really speaks to the state that Mephibosheth was in terms of his chronic pain and his chronic loss. Now, I'm sure that on day one, everyone had sympathy for the prince who broke his legs. And I'm sure that there are people here tonight, and on day one, everyone had sympathy for you. They had sympathy for you when you came to the hospital for the first time. They had sympathy for you when you got handed your P45. Everyone turned up to the funeral, but as days turned into weeks, and as weeks turned into months, and as months turned into years, all of those people who once said, oh, it doesn't matter, just call me about anything, or you'll get through this, or whatever you need, just let me know. Suddenly there are fewer and fewer people who care once it's gone past day one. Suddenly there are fewer and fewer people who care about, because they're no longer a prince who's broken their legs, but they're a man who can't walk. And suddenly it's not sympathy, suddenly it's, why don't you just get over it? Or why are you talking about this again? And the people in this chronic side of pain and the chronic side of loss are looking at themselves going, I was meant to have something better. I was meant to go and get a degree. I was meant to go and have a job. I was meant to go and have a family, but I was dropped back then. And the voices of the people around you keep progressing away from sympathy and away from help. And you've got a choice. You can keep opening up about what's inside you. You can keep opening up about your pain, and you can keep seeing the people walk out of your life. Or you can shut up and hope that you won't be left alone. You're either in the land of no speaking or the land of nothing. And either way, you're in Lodabar. And if this is you tonight, then what hope is there? Where can you go? I want to tell you that Jesus wants you to come to his home. You see, the night before his trial and crucifixion, Jesus spoke to his disciples and said, there is more than enough room in my Father's house. If this were not so, would I have told you that I'm going to prepare a place for you? When everything is ready, I'll come and get you so that you will always be with me where I am. And now we see that this account of David calling Mephibosheth out of Lodabar and into his home is an image of what Jesus came to earth to achieve. Jesus is the King who calls us home. His promise gives us safety. His table gives us dignity. And his affirmation gives us identity. So how do we come home? First of all, we have to acknowledge who the King is. Now, it wouldn't have been hard to believe that Mephibosheth would have been a bit bitter about how his life was. He was once royalty. He was destined for the throne. But now if he wanted to go into the palace, it wouldn't be with himself as king. For us, if we're determined to remain the highest authority in our lives, we'll be at the mercy of all of life's storms, every economic uncertainty, every relationship breakdown, every career progression or regression. And from the outside, it will look like we've chosen a borrowed shack in the ghetto of Lodabar over a life in the palace. Jesus, if we want a home that God offers, we have to accept Jesus' lordship. As Jesus himself said, if you cling to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for me, you will find it. And this is the promise that gives us safety. The second thing that we have to do is come broken. You see, one of the reasons that I love this passage is because at the end of it, Mephibosheth doesn't walk. He brings his brokenness to the king, and you have to understand he would have looked broken. You would have looked down and his legs would have been wasted and his bones would have been a little bit different, and that would have put pressure on different parts of his skin and causing them to break down, and then the effects of incontinence would have broken down those wounds further. He would have looked sick. He would have looked unkempt. And that was only partially taken away for him, but he was healed in the sense that his inability was no longer a disability. You see, in the king's house, he had people to take care of his body, and he had fields that created an income and a wealth and helped him engage in society. Bishop T.D. Jakes describes a scene where Mephibosheth is sat at the king's table. And around him are all the sons of David who the Bible goes great lengths to describe as being beautiful and physically perfect. And Mephibosheth would have been sat there with him, and David would have stretched out his tablecloth and it would have covered all of their legs. And when the tablecloth went down and covered their legs, everyone at that table would have been in absolute equality with each other. And it's at that table that we have dignity. You couldn't tell who was broken. You couldn't tell who was adopted or invited or who was born there. They were all equal. Jesus said, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest." He didn't say, "Come to me, all of you who are rested." Our brokenness is not a barrier to the King's house. And thirdly, we need humility. It would have been an awful journey from Lodabar to the palace for Mephibosheth. We've already described his appearance that he would have been ashamed of, but he would have been dependent on everyone for every aspect of his travel. He would have been dependent on other people for every physical need. And we see how he refers to himself as a dog. And this takes humility. But throughout the Gospels, we see an interesting pattern emerge, which is wherever there are pairs of people, such as the Pharisee and the tax collector praying, or the prodigal sons, or the parable of the wedding feast, and it goes on. But wherever we see these couples of people, we see something interesting. You see, Jesus never accepts people because they're good, or because they're religious, or because they're clever, or because they're kind, or because they're hardworking. But when it comes to the kingdom of God, we see that the humble are accepted and the proud are rejected. Jesus puts this quite bluntly. But those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. We see here that our identity, our core definition, is found in his affirmation, accessed through humility. And now there are some of us here who would consider ourselves already to be home. And for those of us like that, I would encourage you to look at the example of Ziba. He brings the names of the people outside of the king's house to the king. And we've got to do this prayerfully. He keeps community. You see, I love how even after all this time, he knows exactly where to find Mephibosheth when the time comes. He must have been in communication with him. And thirdly, if you read on in the account, you'll see that Ziba has a key role in delivering the healing that the king sets out. And we have got to be carriers of the king's mercy. But how do you know? And how do you know that the king wants us home? You see, we see Jesus, Son of God, put to death on a cross. And in Mark chapter 15, verse 34, we read that Jesus called out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you abandoned me?" Now, some bystanders misunderstood and thought he was calling for the prophet Elijah. One of them ran and filled a sponge with sour wine. "Wait," he said, "let's see whether Elijah comes to take him down." And they waited and waited. But for the first time in Jesus' life, we see that he calls out to heaven and heaven doesn't respond. You see, Jesus was disconnected from his Father and left in a place of absolute silence and absolute nothingness. He entered the ultimate Lodabar, the place that we should have been, so that we could leave. Jesus prepared a place in his Father's house for you by leaving his place and going to the cross. And the extent to which you see Jesus doing that for you will be the extent to which you know that you can trust him. Okay? So your home, whether it was somewhere good or somewhere that you'd rather forget, it points to somewhere else. It points to a true home with a place prepared for you on the promise of the King who was willing to die to get you there. Now, there are people in our world who are spending all of their time and money and their whole life for just a shred of security, for just a shred of dignity, and for just the tiniest bit of identity. Their needs are met in this true home. We need to let them know about the hope that we have. And that's when we'll see the lives changed. That's when we'll see communities transformed. And that's when we'll see our city saved.